Sweeney Todd, man or myth? The legend of Sweeney Todd, the notorious demon barber of Fleet Street, has captivated audiences for centuries. Most recently, the BBC's latest adaptation of the tale has breathed new life into the sinister character, garnering high praise from critics. This latest production taps into the unsettling horror that has made Todds such a lasting figure in popular culture. Though this story has been retold in many forms, its most famous rendition comes from Stephen Sondheim's 1979 musical, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Sondheim's macabre ballad begins with a haunting invitation. Attend the tale of Sweeney Todd. His skin was pale, and his eye was odd. He shaved the faces of gentlemen, who never thereafter were heard of again. Yet despite its frequent dramatization, the question remains, was Sweeney Todd a real figure, or merely a terrifying boogeyman conjured by the imagination of a society fascinated by horror? While some scholars, such as playwright Christopher Bond, insist that Todd's story is pure fiction, others believe there is a kernel of truth beneath the legend. For 2 centuries, readers of penny dreadfuls and theatre-goers alike have been enthralled by the idea of a murderous barber who dispatched his customers with the flick of a razor, only for their remains to be served up in Mrs. Lovett's infamous meat pies. Though many consider this tale nothing more than gothic fantasy, it is worth exploring whether the myth might have roots in reality. The real Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd is often regarded as an English folktale, a sinister figure used to frighten children, much like the boogeyman of other cultures. However, it seemed that even the most horrifying legends are often grounded in some element of truth. Indeed, while many details surrounding Sweeney Todd are undoubtedly exaggerated, British author Peter Henning's research suggests that Todd may have been more than just a fictional character. According to Henning, there was indeed a mad barber who used a trapdoor to dispatch his clients, though the events of his life were far less romantic than those depicted in the stage and screen adaptations. Todd's tale may prey upon our most primal fears, being vulnerable in the hands of another, and the ghastly prospect of cannibalism. After all, the notion of unknowingly consuming human flesh, cleverly disguised as a savory pie, taps into our instinctive discomfort with trust in those who prepare our food. These fears, which resonate just as strongly today, help Todd's legend to endure. Though the tale has been retold as high melodrama, the true Sweeney Todd, if he existed, was an amoral man, driven by greed and utterly lacking in remorse. His story, far from being the romanticized version we know today, was likely a grim account of a crime and cruelty in a rapidly growing city. The Great Pit, London in the 18th century. There's a hole in the world, like a great black pit, and the vermin of the world inhabit it, and its morals aren't worth what a pig could spit, and it goes by the name of London. No Place Like London by Stephen Sondheim from Sweeney Todd. London in the 18th century was, by all accounts, a city teetering on the edge of chaos. The Industrial Revolution had driven vast numbers of people from the countryside into the capital in search of work. Overcrowded, unsanitary, and rife with crime, the city's streets were a dangerous place for anyone, especially after dark. For the wealthy, there were pockets of comfort, but for the majority, life was harsh, and survival often came down to the whims of fate or luck. Disease, poverty, and crime were rampant, as the infrastructure of London struggled to keep pace with its swelling population. At the time, society was divided into distinct classes: the gentry, the merchants, and the vast working class. Below even this working class, however, existed the criminal underclass, made up of thieves, beggars, prostitutes, and the desperately impoverished. Moving upward in society was a rarity. More often, individuals would find themselves descending further into hardship. It was a time when life was truly cheap, and few would blink at the misfortune of others. The gap between rich and poor was stark, and for those on the bottom rung of society, options were limited. The Thames River, now synonymous with British history and culture, was in the 18th century the filthiest river in Europe, teeming with raw sewage and industrial waste. The city's lack of sanitation meant that diseases like smallpox, plague, and consumption were common, and death often came quickly for those living in the overcrowded tenements and slums that dotted the landscape. Charles Dickens would later capture this bleak environment in his works, writing of a city where drunken men and women were positively wallowing in filth, and ill-looking fellows prowled the streets with ill intentions. This grim backdrop is the world into which Sweeney Todd was born. The city itself was a place of violence, disorder, and brutal punishment. A world where a criminal's life was worth little more than a few shillings. Law enforcement was rudimentary at best, and it often seemed that the underworld operated with impunity. It was a setting ripe for the creation, or perhaps the inspiration, of a figure like Sweeney Todd, whose exploits would embody the dark fears of urban life. Bloody business. Crime and punishment in London. Law enforcement in London during the 18th century was a haphazard affair. The English common law, upon which society's rules were based, was a loose collection of local customs rather than clearly defined legal code. Policing was left largely to local constables and night watchmen, who were often ill-equipped to handle the rampant crime that plagued the streets. For a long time it was up to the victim of a crime to catch the perpetrator and bring them to justice, a system that naturally lent itself to chaos. With theft being a capital crime, many criminals, knowing the consequences if caught, preferred to leave no witnesses behind. The formal development of policing in London can be traced back to King Edgar in the 10th century, who created the role of shire reeves or sheriffs to maintain the peace in rural areas. However, this system was not particularly effective in the burgeoning metropolis of London. By the 18th century, crime had reached epidemic levels, and the city was notorious for its lawlessness. Attempts to reform the system were made throughout the 18th century, including the introduction of the Bow Street Runners in 1748 by Henry Fielding. This small, paid force, often regarded as the first professional police force in Britain, was tasked with investigating crime and apprehending criminals. However, with a mere 15 men to patrol a city of hundreds of thousands, they were fighting a losing battle. As H. Paul Jeffreys noted in his work Bloody Business, Londoners lived in a world where violence, disorder, and brutal punishments were still part of the normal background of life. This was the violent, chaotic world in which Sweeney Todd would become infamous. A barber by trade, Todd's murderous exploits were made possible by a city that was, for the most part, indifferent to the plight of its citizens. While tales of Sweeney Todd's grisly crimes are often told with a sense of gothic horror, it's important to remember that this story reflects the harsh realities of urban life in 18th century London. Sweeney's World. His voice was soft, his manner mild. He seldom laughed, but he often smiled. He'd seen how civilized men behave. He never forgot, and he never forgave. Not Sweeney. Not Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. The Ballad of Sweeney Todd by Stephen Sondheim. Sweeney Todd's origins are as grim as the city that shaped him. Born into a poor family in the working-class neighborhood of Stepney, Todd was the only child of silk workers. His parents, both alcoholics, were consumed by their addiction to gin, leaving little time or energy for their son. Todd grew up in a city where gin was often referred to as the opiate of the masses, a cheap, accessible form of escape from the crushing poverty that dominated the lives of London's poor. Gin mills advertised that one could get drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2p, clean straw provided, a reflection of the despair that gripped the lower classes. Todd's upbringing was marked by neglect and cruelty. His father, a violent man, beat him regularly, while his mother, though more affectionate, was often too intoxicated to care for him properly. Sweeney Todd would later express his deep resentment towards his mother, stating, "What the devil did she bring me into this world for unless she had plenty of money to give me so that I might enjoy myself in it?" It was clear from an early age Todd had developed a bitter and cynical view of the world. The defining moment in Todd's young life came during one of the coldest winters on record in London. His parents, seeking warmth in the local gin mills, left him alone at home one night and never returned. It is believed they succumbed to the freezing conditions or met a more sinister fate in their search for drink. Left to fend for himself, young Sweeney was eventually taken in by the local parish and apprenticed to a cutler, beginning a path that would ultimately lead to his notoriety as the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Apprentice turned criminal, Sweeney Todd's early years. Sweeney Todd's path to becoming the Demon Barber of Fleet Street began during his apprenticeship with a cutler, a tradesman who specialized in crafting and sharpening knives, razors, and other cutting tools. In 18th century London, apprenticeships were not opportunities for advancement or education as they might be considered today. They were often little more than indentured servitude. Apprentices, particularly those who were orphans like Todd, were vulnerable to mistreatment and exploitation, and Todd's experience was no exception. His master, John Crook, was known for his sharp blades and harsher temperament. Todd, like many apprentices, lived in poverty and was treated with little care or regard. The government at the time issued a report on the dire conditions of apprenticeships. The master may be a tiger in cruelty. Few people take much notice. The fate of many a poor child, not only to be half-starved, but also to thieve and steal for his master. It wasn't long before Todd found himself on the wrong side of the law. At age 14, he was arrested and convicted of petty larceny. Though the details of the crime are scarce, the incident marked Todd's first encounter with the criminal justice system. Had he been just a few years older, his punishment might have been death by hanging. Instead, Todd was shown an unusual amount of leniency for the time and was sentenced to 5 years in the notorious Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison, a school for criminals. Newgate Prison, where Sweeney Todd was incarcerated, was infamous even in its day for its appalling conditions and the cruelty with which prisoners were treated. Far from a place of reform, it was a hellish environment where brutality reigned supreme. Dickens himself was horrified by what he witnessed in Newgate, describing the prisoners as wretched inmates, confined in dark, narrow, damp, and noisome cells. For a young Sweeney Todd, Newgate was a formative experience. His time in prison not only hardened him, but also introduced him to the darker sides of human nature. It was here that Todd learned the barber's trade from a fellow prisoner, Plummer, a convict serving time for embezzlement. As the prison barber, Plummer provided shaves and haircuts to inmates, including those awaiting execution. It's likely that Todd, acting as Plummer's apprentice, participated in these grim final rituals. The influence of Newgate on Todd's character cannot be overstated. It was in this grim setting that he began to nurture his deep hatred for society. His experience in this prison, coupled with his abusive upbringing, only served to sharpen his sense of grievance against a world that had offered him nothing but hardship and cruelty. The First Blood. Upon his release from Newgate at the age of 19, Sweeney Todd set out to make a name for himself, not as an honest tradesman, but as a flying barber, one of the many itinerant barbers who practiced their craft whenever they could find a space in a crowded city street. Flying barbers often fought bitter territorial battles, sometimes ending in bloodshed, and it wasn't long before Todd made his first foray into murder. The story goes that one day, a drunken gentleman entered Todd's makeshift shop, boasting about his recent exploits with a woman who, by his description, appeared to be Todd's lover. Fueled by jealousy and rage, Todd seized his razor and slit the man's throat from ear to ear. It was the first of many killings that would cement Todd's reputation as the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Though this first murder went largely unnoticed by authorities, it marked the turning point in Todd's life. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Over the next few years, he scraped together enough money to open a more permanent shop on Fleet Street, the location that would become infamous for the horrors that took place within its walls. The Fleet Street Shop. In 1785, Sweeney Todd established his barbershop at 186 Fleet Street, a narrow, unassuming building wedged between St. Dunstan's Church and Hen and Chicken Court. The location, near the Temple Bar, was not the most prestigious for a barber, but it suited Todd's purposes perfectly. Fleet Street, known for its bustling activity, was a place where people could easily come and go without being noticed. The area was also home to many taverns and gin houses, adding to the general air of lawlessness. Todd's shop itself was small and dark, with a single barber chair in the center of the room and various implements of his trade hanging on the walls. For those passing by, it would have seemed like any other barber's establishment. But beneath the surface, quite literally, Todd was plotting his grisly enterprise. The shop's location next to Dunstan's provided access to a series of tunnels and catacombs that had been largely forgotten by the time Todd took over the space. These subterranean passages would play a key role in his murderous scheme. Todd's ingenious and horrifying method of disposing of his victims was perhaps the most infamous aspect of his operation. Using his skills as a cutler, Todd installed a trapdoor beneath the barber's chair. With the pull of a lever, the chair would tip backward, sending the unsuspecting customer tumbling into the basement below, where the fall alone often proved fatal. If not, Todd would dispatch them with a swift flick of his razor, ensuring that no witnesses could leave his shop alive. This macabre system allowed Todd to murder his clients in secret while maintaining the appearance of a respectable businessman. His victims disappeared without a trace, and their remains were quickly disposed of in the tunnels beneath the church, or more horrifyingly, repurposed by his accomplice, Missys Lovett, in her meat pies. An evil partnership, Mrs. Lovett and the meat pies. As Sweeney Todd's murderous enterprise grew, he found an accomplice in a woman named Missys Love, who ran a pie shop on Bell Yard, just a short distance from Todd's Barbershop on Fleet Street. Mrs. Lovett's exact history remains something of a mystery, though her surname is commonly recorded as Marjorie. According to some accounts, her first husband died under suspicious circumstances, and it was not long after this that she and Todd began their gruesome partnership. Mrs. Lovett was by no means a figure of romance or charm. Contemporary descriptions of her portray her as a harsh, unattractive woman with a cold, calculating nature. Yet, like Todd, she had a taste for the finer things in life, and her pie shop, though humble in appearance, was a profitable enterprise. She prided herself on the quality of her pies, which attracted both the rich and poor alike. What her customers didn't realize, however, was the secret ingredient that made her pies so savory. Before Mrs. Lovett joined Todd's operation, the barber had been disposing of his victims' bodies by hiding them in the forgotten crypts beneath St. Dunstan's Church. But as the number of victims increased, this method became unsustainable. Mrs. Lovett provided the perfect solution. She would take the remains of Todd's victims and use the meat to fill her pies, which she then sold to unsuspecting customers. The demand for her pies only grew as word spread of their unique and rich flavor. This arrangement was convenient for both parties. Todd no longer had to worry about hiding the evidence of his crimes, and Mrs. Lovett's business flourished. Together, they turned murder into a profitable venture, with Todd supplying the meat and Lovett turning it into pies that were quickly snapped up by eager customers. It was a partnership rooted in greed and cruelty, with no regard for the lives they were destroying, or the people unknowingly consuming the remains of Todd's victims. Sweeney Todd's downfall, a stench too strong to ignore. While Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett carried out their gruesome business with apparent impunity, their crimes did not go entirely unnoticed. As the bodies piled up in the crypts beneath St. Dunstan's, a terrible stench began to emanate from the building. The smell became so unbearable that parishioners could barely sit through services, and the church officials were forced to investigate the cause of the foul odor. At first, it was assumed that the smell was simply the result of poor ventilation in the crypts, where bodies had been buried for centuries. However, as the weeks passed and the smell worsened, church authorities contacted the Bow Street Runners, the precursor to Scotland Yard, to conduct a more thorough investigation. The runners were a small but professional police force, tasked with solving the most serious crimes in the city, and they took the matter seriously. Led by Sir Richard Blunt, the chief magistrate at Wall Street, the runners began their investigation by exploring the crypts beneath the church. What they found was horrifying. Piled high in the catacombs were the decomposing remains of countless bodies, their flesh partly stripped from their bones. It was clear that something far more sinister than poor burial practices was at play. Blunt and his men followed a trail of blood-stained footprints that led from the crypt to the back of a shop on Bell Yard, Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. Suspicions mounted, but Blunt knew he needed more evidence to directly tie the disappearances to both Lovett and Sweeney Todd. With careful planning, Blunt placed several of his runners undercover, posing as customers at Todd's Barbershop. Over the course of several days, they watched as men entered the shop, but were never seen to leave. The arrest of Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett. Once Blunt had gathered enough evidence, he acted swiftly to bring both Todd and Lovett to justice. Mrs. Lovett was arrested first, but not without incident. When word spread throughout the neighborhood that the contents of her infamous meat pies had been discovered, an angry mob formed outside her shop, demanding vengeance. The Wall Street runners had to escort her to safety in a carriage to prevent her from being lynched on the spot. She was taken to Newgate Prison, where she would later meet a grim end. The arrest of Sweeney Todd was more straightforward. The runners entered his shop while he was alone and quietly took him into custody. Todd did not resist and was quickly locked away in Newgate Prison alongside Mrs. Lovett. Despite the mounting evidence against them, both Todd and Lovett continued to deny any wrongdoing. Todd, in particular, maintained his innocence, insisting that he had simply been running a barber shop and knew nothing of the disappearances. The trial of Sweeney Todd. The trial of Sweeney Todd, which took place in December of 1801, was one of the most sensational events of its time. The public was captivated by the grisly details of Todd's crimes, and the newspapers reported on the trial with breathless excitement. The court proceedings were attended by large crowds eager to see justice served. Todd was charged with the murder of Francis Thornhill, a sailor who had gone missing after visiting Todd's shop. The prosecution, led by the Attorney General, built a strong case against Todd, presenting evidence that linked him to the disappearances of several men, as well as the discovery of the remains in the crypts beneath St. Dunstan's. Witnesses testified to seeing Todd's customers enter his shop but never emerge, and items belonging to the victims were found in Todd's possession. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Dr. Sylvester Steers, who had treated Thornhill for a leg injury. Steers identified the remains found in the crypt as those of Thornhill, based on the distinctive fracture he had treated. This early use of forensic evidence was groundbreaking at the time and left little doubt as to Todd's guilt. Todd's defense was weak at best. His barrister argued that the case against Todd was based on circumstantial evidence and that there was no direct proof linking him to the murders. He attempted to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, suggesting that bone fragments could belong to anyone. However, the jury was not convinced. After just 5 minutes of deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict. The sentencing and execution of Sweeney Todd. After the jury delivered its swift guilty verdict, Sweeney Todd stood before the judge to receive his sentence. The presiding judge, his face grave with the weight of the trial's revelations, addressed Todd in a manner befitting the seriousness of his crimes. He condemned Todd for his heinous acts, stating that society could not do otherwise than put out of life someone who, like yourself, has been a terror and a scourge. Todd, ever defiant, maintained his innocence, declaring, "I am not guilty." But the court was unmoved. The sentence was clear. Sweeney Todd was to be hanged by the neck until dead. On January 25, 1802, Sweeney Todd was led to the gallows in the yard of Newgate Prison. Thousands gathered to witness the execution of the infamous demon Barber, whose name had become synonymous with terror. Accounts from the day note that Todd died hard. a phrase used to describe those who struggled and fought in their final moments on the gallows. In keeping with the practices of the time, Todd's body was handed over to the barber surgeons for dissection, an ironic end for a man who had made so many others suffer under the razor. With Todd's death, the immediate chapter of his brutal crimes came to a close. However, for the public, the tale of Sweeney Todd had already begun to take on a life of its own, evolving from a grim reality into the stuff of urban legend. The legend of Sweeney Todd. He kept a shop in London town, of fancy clients and good renown. And what if none of their souls were saved? They went to their maker, impeccably shaved, by Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. The Ballad of Sweeney Todd by Stephen Sondheim. The execution of Sweeney Todd did little to quell the public's fascination with his story. In fact, it had the opposite effect, with the gruesome details of his life quickly being spun into sensational tales in the popular press. Not long after his death, the first of the penny dreadfuls, cheap, serialized stories filled with crime and melodrama, took up his tale, embellishing it with every retelling. Todd's real-life brutality was transformed into a gothic tale, complete with trapdoors, hidden tunnels, and the sinister Missys Lovett, who became as much a part of the legend as Todd himself. One of the most enduring accounts of Todd's life appeared in The String of Pearls, a serialized novel that was first published in 1846. This version of the story added a love interest and a hero, elements designed to appeal to Victorian audiences hungry for melodrama and intrigue. In The String of Pearls, Todd's apprentice, Tobias, becomes the story's moral center, ultimately exposing Todd's crimes and bringing him to justice. The story was soon adapted for the stage, becoming a hit at the Britannia Theatre and cementing Todd's place in popular culture. For centuries, Sweeney Todd's stories has continued to evolve, moving from penny dreadfuls and stage plays to films and musicals. Perhaps the most famous adaptation is Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, which premiered on Broadway in 1979. In Sondheim's version, Todd is portrayed not merely as a madman, but as a tragic figure, wronged by society and driven to revenge. The musical adds a layer of complexity to Todd's character, allowing audiences to sympathize with his plight, even as they recoil from his actions. The success of Sondheim's musical, which won multiple Tony Awards and was later adapted into a feature film starring Johnny Depp, brought Todd's story to a new generation of audiences. Despite the embellishments, the core of the legend remains the same. A man driven to murder by greed, vengeance, and madness, whose actions left an indelible mark on London's dark history. Sweeney Todd. Myth, legend, or reality? While Sweeney Todd's tale has undoubtedly been exaggerated over the years, there is little doubt that the character is rooted in the grim realities of 18th century London. Whether Todd was a real person or an amalgamation of several figures remains a subject of debate among historians. British author Peter Haining, who conducted extensive research into Todd's life, argued that there was indeed a historical figure who committed crimes similar to those attributed to Todd. Yet, as with many urban legends, the line between fact and fiction has long since blurred. What remains clear, however, is the lasting power of Todd's story. In a city teeming with crime and poverty, the figure of the demon barber became a symbol of the dangers lurking in the shadows of urban life. His tale played on the deepest fears of the time: vulnerability, murder, and even cannibalism. And while many may dismiss the more fantastical elements of the story, it continues to capture the imagination of audiences around the world. As Anna Pavord of the London Observer wrote in 1979, Sweeney Todd will never die. We all need boogeymen, and he was boogier than most. Let us know what you think of Sweeney Todd in the comments, and thank you for joining us.